Hello, and welcome to Post Games, a podcast about why and how we love video games. I am your host, Chris Plant, and I am so happy to have you here. Now, last year, I helped oversee the first major national survey of anime consumption in the United States. Before the survey, I knew that anime had, obviously, to me, achieved pop culture status, with characters from Dragon Ball appearing in Fortnite, and musicians like Megan Thee Stallion wearing over a dozen anime cosplays. And even still, the numbers surprised me. Nearly half of Gen Z watches anime once a week, and a quarter of millennials do the same. 44% of anime viewers have had a crush on an anime character, and 65% of anime viewers find the form more emotionally compelling than other forms of media. Anime fans have claimed to watch for escape and for comfort, but also for strength as a tool to prepare them for a big test or a challenging day at work. We ran this survey at Polygon, a site broadly focused on video games, because while games and anime are two different mediums, they have for decades influenced and elevated one another. I don't think either of them are where they are today without each other. In the line between the two, it is blurrier and blurrier and blurrier, with shows inspiring games that inspire more shows. We have game companies using anime to promote their games, and we have anime companies using games to fund their anime. So how did we get here? To find out, I reached out to the founder and host of the hit anime YouTube channel, Mother's Basement, Geoff Thew. This week on Post Games, how video games and anime took over pop culture together. Act 1, you got anime in your video games. Act 2, you got video games in your anime. Patreon bonus, Geoff sticks around to recommend the mini anime that every gamer should watch. And Act 3, the news of the week. I am so excited to share this last big interview of 2025 with you, so let's get right to it. Act 1, you got anime in your video games. Geoff Thew is the host of Mother's Basement, a YouTube channel that helps millions of people each year find their next favorite anime. His videos have unpacked the hidden meaning in anime openings. They've explored the politics of One Piece. They have sifted through the trashiest seasonal anime for stuff that, if not good, is at least, let's say, stimulating of the other senses. He also co-hosts the podcast Quest for the Best, in which, I quote, 3 friends set off to answer the greatest question of them all. What are the best 100 anime of all time? Before the YouTube channel and the podcast, Thew cut his teeth in games journalism, making him an ideal guest for explaining how and why games and anime culture overlap. Can you tell us about, or one or two really early examples of a game that is taking inspiration from anime or based on anime?
Okay, well, I mean, the earliest 2 games that I know of based on anime are both arcade games from 1980 and 1983. They were both based on Lupin III, and one of them looks like an arcade game from 1980, so, you know, it's like it's just stick figures walking around a maze. But then in 1983, you know, there was the whole Dragon's Lair craze, right? And everybody was trying to get in on that. And obviously not everybody had the money to contract Don Bluth or Disney or something to animate for them. So this one company had the brilliant idea of licensing 2 Lupin III movies, stitching them together, and putting them in an arcade cabinet they called Cliffhanger. So that FMV technology is the earliest place that you see like anime graphics coming in, which makes sense. But when you like look around the Japanese produced 8-bit game library, you see a lot of that like chibi stylization. You know, like River City Ransom has that like cute, super deformed style with the big eyes. At that point, it's like the player's imagination is doing so much work that they can easily translate something based explicitly on an anime to like, oh, this is something cartoony that we can sell with cartoony art in the West.
Are anime-inspired games good? Are we talking about like the high end of it, and what sits beneath is a pure poison?
I don't think it's pure poison. I mean, like, on a certain level, right? Because like all video games are animation, right? So all video games are inspired by the animation that the people making them are immersed in. So like, you know, it runs the gamut the same way that any game coming out of Japan does. And like all games that came out of Japan to a certain extent, they're drawing on these same design techniques and the similar approach to sketching out the characters and stuff. There's definitely a lot of like slop in the license space, right? There's more terrible Dragon Ball and Gundam games than you can imagine. You know, they'd try to make like a tactical game based on Gundam in like a couple months. There were a lot of platformers, shoot 'em ups, beat 'em ups, fighting games. Whatever was popular in the arcades at the time, they would slap as many anime licenses as they could on them. And, you know, some are really good. There's a really good Sailor Moon beat 'em up, for example, on the Super Nintendo.
You said a thing earlier that I think is like smart and spot on. This idea of video games are animation, and the people who are making them are taking reference from the animation that they already consume.
Yeah.
And right now, that means you consume global animation. So if you are localizing a game in the US, you're already consuming a lot of anime anyway.
Most likely, yeah.
But this era that we're talking about early on in the 80s and 90s, that's just not true. Like, maybe you've seen Ranma Half, maybe you've seen some Sailor Moon. Like, it depends on what your Sam Goody has. But more than likely, you're localizing a game and you're mostly familiar with Western animation. What are the people who are bringing these games over from Japan into the West doing to the games then when they're bringing them over?
A classic example of that is there's this NES platformer called Monkey Magic. It's a Dragon Ball licensed platformer with the edges sanded off. It's literally just, they're like, oh, it's a cartoon monkey man going on adventures. And like, this was before Dragon Ball was a saleable brand in North America. You know, they were just like, let's pretend this is this new thing. Nobody's going to care about Dragon Ball. It probably wouldn't have sold better then, but now it would most likely be worth even more than it is if they kept that Dragon Ball branding on it as like one of the first Dragon Ball games to make it to North America. That question ties into the whole culture shift that happened basically as I was growing up in the mid 90s. Because like prior to 1990, any anime that made it over here, almost any anime was heavily sanitized. Space Battleship Yamato became Star Blazers. Robotech was like a mashup of Macross, Super Dimension Cavalry Southern Cross, and like one other thing that they like mashed together into this weird Star Trek timeline that these works weren't originally a part of at all. And you go back further than that, you actually get more faithful dubs in like the 70s. The Speed Racer dub is surprisingly faithful. You know, like they change all the characters' names, right? But like that's all they do to pretend that it's an American cartoon. It's like they keep the lip flaps exactly. There's none of the censorship that we got in the early 90s of like, trying to pretend they're not shooting kids with guns. They shoot kids with guns in every episode of Speed Racer, basically. There was, in those early days, they didn't care so much. And then through the 70s and 80s, there was, I think, this attempt by America to assert their soft power over all of these different imports. That probably had a lot to do with the Japanophobia that was rising up through like, because the Japanophilia and Japanophobia kind of came up at the same time in American culture, where it was like, oh no, Japan's going to overtake us as an economic power. And wow, Japan's doing all this cool stuff. They make the best cars, you know? So there was this dualism there that you see a lot in Cyberpunk. And, you know, if you want to get psychological about it, maybe these brands were, you know, trying to to paper over the Japanese influence to like make their customers less wary or whatever. I don't know. But after Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball hit, and those were really big hits in the early 90s, and then obviously Pokemon blew up Saturday morning television. It was the biggest thing in history in terms of like cross-media marketing. I don't know what the ratings were exactly, but I don't think any kids show had ever hit those numbers before. It was like a global phenomenon. And at that point, they were like, oh, we don't have to spend all this money rebranding these things. We can just start releasing them with the branding, like with the original anime artwork.
So it sounds like what you're saying is in the 80s, there is this cultural shift that is bigger than just anime and video games, where there's a skepticism of Japanese culture, where you're both desiring the technology but wanting to present it as American. Yeah. And that changes in the 90s, especially with Pokemon. Do we start to see more Japanese games, and specifically, I guess, games based off of anime properties, coming to America at that point?
Yeah, absolutely. You got the first Dragon Ball games on the PS1 that made it over here. There were a few Super Nintendo games that made it through unscathed. I've got a Ranma fighting game that I really like. I mean, it's not a great, it's just a Street Fighter clone. But what I find the most interesting on the non-licensed side of things, right? So the earliest places that you see anime storytelling influence are in visual novels, obviously, which evolved out of the graphic adventure genre, which itself is very heavily influenced by cartoons. If you look at, the output of LucasArts and whatnot. And then visual novels were inspired by that, and they take a lot of influence from anime. They kind of took in a lot of the romance tropes that were popular in anime, codified those into the dating sim, and then that and a few manga that were sort of floating around like Ranma and anime like Tenchi Muyo kind of coalesced into the harem anime genre. So that's one of the earliest examples of like an anime to game to anime pipeline. JRPGs, I don't have to tell you how many JRPGs there are out there where there's some kind of girl with a magic pendant related to an ancient civilization with untold secrets that the hero's got to do. Like, there's tons of games that just ripped off Laputa. The earliest JRPG that would be considered, the start of JRPGs as we know them today, Dragon Quest, was literally Akira Toriyama's artwork running off of his success with Dr. Slump. And Dragon Ball came out, I think, the same year that the first Dragon Quest hit. And that was just an amazing cross-media synergy that they had going. You could think of that as an early example of what Pokemon eventually turned into a whole branding strategy. But then as you move into the 32-bit era, every game starts having serious storytelling.
What does the switch from cartridge to disc do for anime-inspired games?
I mean, so my go-to example for that would be, or my two go-to examples, what I think are the most anime games on the PlayStation are Resident Evil and Metal Gear Solid.
Tell me more. I want to all of this.
So like Resident Evil, if you really think about what it's doing with its pre-rendered backgrounds and the 3D characters on top, is very similar to what you do with cell animation. You're just putting the player in control of illusion of a 3D space made of 2D images, right? And, I think probably the more advanced animation techniques in Japan probably explain why pre-rendered games coming out of Japan just generally were better at working the camera angles, better at creating a sense of space. Alone in the Dark is cool, right? But it didn't really take off until Resident Evil. And I think a lot of that was just they were growing up on better animated television. And obviously movies are a big inspiration too. But there's so much anime bullshit, for lack of a better word, in all of Resident Evil. When we think of Resident Evil, we think of it from like the Western marketing perspective of, it's this schlocky zombie thing inspired by Romero, and that's absolutely part of it, right? But like when you really get into the lore of the Resident Evil games, right? There's a lot of inspiration from Kamen Rider and like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and Bao have like little. You can tell that the Resi guys were JoJo's fans. And, you know, the lore gets into this kooky tokusatsu anime stuff. Like tokusatsu is special effects film, Godzilla, Kamen Rider, Super Sentai / Power Rangers. You know, anything where they go into a quarry and set off a bunch of fireworks around guys in rubber suits is the tokusatsu space. And Kamen Rider, one of the big defining tokusatsu series, was based on a manga, which also heavily inspired a lot of anime. And the bioorganic weapons and the secret organizations of Resident Evil are inspired by that.
The Resident Evil thing is so spot on and something I've never considered, because when I think of the 32-bit era in Japanese video games, and specifically anime-influenced video games, I think of the Sega Saturn. Yeah. I think of RPGs. I think of Lunar. I think of anime actually being in the series. And I had not considered, it doesn't have to be so literal. Like, my mind is a very literal projection of that.
Yeah, but like, I mean, if you take out the B-movie cutscenes in the original Resident Evil, which you absolutely shouldn't do because they're great, but there's a lot of anime-ish moments, right? And that evolution of how cutscenes were done in Japan, I mean, you really see it in Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid is a mecha anime that you can play, right? Kojima was so big into anime, and you can, if you've played his early games, you can see that a lot in Snatcher and Policenauts. Policenauts is a point-and-click adventure where every single woman in the entire game, her breasts are an interactive object. That's some of the earliest anime influence.
It's so Kojima.
So Kojima. But like a lot of the stuff that we think of as so Kojima is just like, the man's an otaku. The man is a big-time otaku who loves his anime. Everything about the cutscenes of Metal Gear Solid that's so iconic to us, and like for a lot of people in America, especially in like the gaming fandom, who weren't watching a lot of kids' cartoons at the time. That was their first real taste of this anime bullshit. And like, when you go into Metal Gear Solid 2 and you're like, why is Otacon talking about banging his sister so much? If you're thinking about this as a game trying to be a movie, that's a little weird. But if you're like, this is a game trying to be an anime, you're like, yeah, okay.
That's a trope.
Yeah. That's one of many tropes. Yeah. And I mean, if you think of any action scene in any Metal Gear Solid game, the first time the cyborg ninja shows up is super anime. A lot of the like little codec conversations have like, it's more of a manga feel there, but that's the undercurrent of a lot of Kojima's oeuvre, especially his early stuff. As technology got more realistic, you know, obviously he goes a little bit more into taking his cinematic influences in. But like, if you really boil it down, Metal Gear Solid is carrying on the legacy of Gundam, using giant robots to talk about war and the political forces that lead to it, what makes a man, and all of this stuff. And I mean, you know, also the more obvious Final Fantasy VII, you could say that the entire gaming landscape in terms of how stories are told was shaped by anime, because Metal Gear Solid and Final Fantasy VII set bars that American game developers were chasing for years.
So they're chasing something they don't even fully understand.
Yeah, they don't have that full context.
Using the Kojima part as a bridge, I would love to hear the wide breadth of anime influence today, because early on you mentioned, there's IP games, there's licensed games on the Nintendo. Today it feels like there's, 10, 12, 100 different ways that anime stretches out across the medium.
I really think it permeates it, you know, like even if people aren't directly inspired by it, They probably played some beat 'em up or fighting game, like going back to Street Fighter, right? The way that Street Fighter works is anime. The Hadouken is a classic anime move, right? Anybody who grew up on Street Fighter, which is literally everybody making fighting games, unless they're making bad fighting games, in which case they're taking more inspiration from Mortal Kombat. Sorry, that's my hot take. But they're taking an anime influence. Even if you look at offshoots like Super Smash Bros., for example, is a very, very anime fighting game. You got dudes flying around. There's a lot of those like crazy acrobatics, signature attacks, and especially if you have items on, you got laser beams firing everywhere. There's like an anime energy to all of that. And it's really hard to think of a fighting game that doesn't have some level of anime nonsense in it.
I want to dig into a few like specific, I don't know if I would even call them niches, but corners of anime game development. When people in the US hear the word fan game, they picture maybe something like a Flash game, something that not a ton of time maybe went into it, or maybe it's a mod. But in Japan, a fan game can mean something very different. Can you explain the difference between what a fan game means in the US versus Japan, especially as it relates to anime?
So what you're referring to there is doujin games, which is a whole subculture in Japan. And, that also ties into when a Westerner hears that phrase, doujinshi, they're probably thinking of hentai, because that's where it's used most often in Western circles, because it's sort of a catch-all term for fan or homemade manga and games. And it's wider spread than just fan games or parody stuff. That's how we know it best. You'll talk about X anime series doujin, type that in on Google. Don't type that in on Google. But if you were to type that in on Google, you'll find a lot of comics, lovingly translated by fans over here, of your favorite characters doing lots of things. But that's just sort of scratching the surface of this whole subculture of DIY artists in all sorts of fields making both parodies of games that they like and their own things. So, for example, you might be passingly familiar with the Toho series of shoot 'em ups. That's a whole doujin ecosystem. It was originally created by one guy, but he said, hey, IP's open. Anybody who wants to touch it can make their own Toho thing. And out of that, you get this whole vibrant universe of people creating games inspired by each other's games, taking the characters and storylines from these original weird, very, very hardcore bullet hell shoot 'em ups that this one guy made and turning those into, fighting games. There's a lot of fighting games or dating sims or RPGs. And there's a whole spectrum of people inspiring each other's creations that comes out of that. And there's this whole culture around fan meetups to sell these games, get them out there into the world, or these manga. You might have heard of Comiket, which is the comic market. It happens every summer and winter at Big Sight, which is where Tokyo Game Show is too, I believe. It's just row after row of people with their own essentially zines or hand-printed one-off floppies of often porn, but also stories that they want to tell, things that they can't get published in regular
traditional
magazines.
venues. Yeah.
Or just things that they want to publish themselves because, they take pride in self-publishing. And that's a creative ecosystem that, yes, has birthed a lot of people making affectionate parodies of their favorite things. It's mostly fan art. Like, you won't usually see doujin games based on really established properties that directly take from them, because copyright laws here are very strict. But there is this carve out where if you go to one of these markets and sell your work at essentially at cost, if you're not making a profit off of it, you can contribute to this fan culture. And again, a lot of that is just people drawing their favorite characters boning.
But on the game side, before we wrap this up, what I hear in the States is, console gaming is dying, or maybe not dying, but it's shrinking in Japan, and that mobile is the place. And that there are games that you would picture, like Persona 5, as an anime-inspired video game in Japan. But then there are also things like Uma Musume or Idolmaster or any of the other games that are happening on mobile. Can you just walk my listeners through how anime-inspired games or licensed games are changing as they are moving into the smartphone era? Or I guess already there.
Yeah, licensed games especially have completely gone away almost in the console space. Like, you still get a few big ticket things like Dragon Ball Kakarot, or there's a Fist of the North Star, Yakuza-like. Fist of the North Star fitness boxing is my current workout routine. But we're getting less and less anime licensed games these days for consoles. That's true. Most of the ones that we do get, there's a lot of complaints about it, is that they're arena fighters. Very recently, we've gone more into classic tag fighters and stuff like that. But like, the general space is clearly declining, and there are fewer interesting titles coming out. And those have been replaced with gacha games, right? Every single anime that has any kind of traction gets a gacha game to extend the brand and to rake in as much money as they can. And some of them are quite good. My wife Yazzie, she's addicted to Jujutsu Kaisen Cursed Clash, which is this sort of a JRPG combat system stapled to a slot machine where you pull out characters and like cards, and it's fun. It's like a well-designed combat loop. It's got visual novel cutscenes that take you through the whole story of the show, and then the game has its own original story too. At the end of the day, it's just like a combat system stapled to some story cutscenes with your party being customizable based on what you pull from the gacha. And that's a template that is hugely successful, that we see for dozens and dozens of different anime licenses. For the completely uninitiated at home, gacha is loot boxes. It's a little different from loot boxes, but not really. Loot boxes were just inspired by the early gacha mechanics of, I think it was Puzzles and Dragons was the first game that really tapped into it and like printed money, just hand over fist printed money for mobile phones. And that's created a space where like anybody who wants to make money off of an anime license, they could try selling the console game the traditional way and like maybe, hit a certain level of market saturation. And then you have your phone and everybody's on their phone all the time, and you can just milk certain people for all it's worth. And that sounds pretty evil, and it is. But the flip side of that is a couple companies that have come out of the space, specifically Cygames, who made Uma Musume, the horse girl game that people are going crazy for now. They also made Grand Blue Fantasy, which these guys believe in console games. They've made console games based on Grand Blue Fantasy, fighting games, full-length, full-fat action RPGs. I think there's an Uma Musume console game coming out too. They take the money that Uma Musume prints, that Grand Blue Fantasy prints, and they put that back into making anime, and not just making anime based on their games to sell their games. Although I will say, Uma Musume anime, one of the most fun anime series that you can be following right now.
Well, I was going to say, this actually might be the perfect spot to take a break, because I want to come back and I want to ask all about the games in anime, the flip side of all of this. Act 2, you got video games in your anime. Okay, we're back. You were just telling me about Uma Musume. You were telling me about a company like Cygames that is putting money from its games into anime. And then I rudely cut you off on Uma Musume. I want to hear more about this idea of people who are using games to actually make good anime right now.
Yeah, I mean, and not just right now. Like, it stretches back a while. There's like interplay between these brands trying to build these living universes that the audience can get immersed in, and where each point of entry is engaging in its own right. But then the really interesting thing that Cygames started doing is they started sponsoring anime that had nothing to do with any of their games, that were just cool projects that they wanted to put some money behind. The earliest one of those is Zombieland Saga, which is a very cute and fun idol anime about undead idols. This guy who's trying to promote tourism in Saga, Japan, resurrects a bunch of dead idols and wannabe idols and like paints them up as living humans and has them do idol stuff to promote tourism to Saga, Japan. It's this crazy, fun, goofy slice of life comedy thing, and it's not trying to sell you a product. It's just trying to be a good anime, and it spawned movies and sequels, and it's become a franchise unto itself. But it started with just making a cool anime, and then some of the best anime of the last couple years, and now they're getting into producing adaptations of cool manga, like The Summer Hikaru Died, which you might have heard of. That's the boys love eldritch horror, and that's again one of the most impressive anime of the entire year. They just pumped their gacha money into making that. They're lined up, I believe, to work on Kagurabachi, which is the biggest thing in Shonen Jump that doesn't have an anime right now. And just everybody's excited for that because Cygames Pictures, the anime studio's hit rate, is basically 100%. And like 50% of it has nothing to do with selling their games.
I want to work our way back up to this, I guess, because I have questions about this moment right now where you mentioned Cygames. I think of Square Enix also as a company that has its hands in anime.
One of the earliest, yeah.
And you mentioned Pokemon earlier, and I think that's the moment that most people listening to this show will be familiar with, the idea of it's all happening at once. There's the game, there's the anime, there's the trading card that is taking over the world. Has that long been a part of anime culture in Japan, where you want to have the game and the anime at the same time? Or is that something that's reserved for, every couple of years you might see something like that?
No, you see it all the time, for sure. Like, a lot of gacha games try to launch alongside an anime. Usually the anime are very bad and it doesn't work, but, they try to suck people in. It's maybe become a little less common for things other than specifically Pokemon, but it's still something you see all the time. Like, even this year, there was this terrible... and I mean, I don't know if the game's terrible, but the anime is terrible. Farmagia. It's like a monster taming / farming RPG with art by Hiro Mashima, the creator of Fairy Tail. And the anime is just absolute dog water. It's going on my worst anime of the year list and pretty close to the top. But, they tried to pump that out at the same time to promote it. Namco does it quite a lot. Although these days there's a bit of a stagger, it feels like, between when the anime releases. It's not so much a everything all at once as we put the game out or we put the anime out and then the game comes later or the anime comes later to like keep sales alive for longer. I don't know exactly what the marketing strategy is. If there's a strategy, it could also just be COVID-related delays on some of the projects, throwing them off.
From there, in kind of building up all these companies, having games and anime at the same time, when we see something like Square Enix appearing literally on the back cover of a manga that you read, or in the closing credits of an anime, why are they there? Is Square Enix, it's just much more than a game company in Japan?
So Square Enix has its own magazine. It has its own Shonen Jump equivalent. I forget the name of it, but that's where Fullmetal Alchemist ran, for example. And that, to me, seems more like less of a let's synergize an anime release and game release, and more let's have this platform for advertising our games. Because, you know, Square Enix made a lot of money because they were able to advertise Dragon Quest in Shonen Jump, for example. Final Fantasy, too, you know, like the Square side of it. Once Final Fantasy was in Shonen Jump, that's when it took off as an RPG series, like really took off compared to what it was doing before. And I think that they wanted a piece of that pie, and that's why they got into that space.
But I guess what I'd say is, should somebody in the States who has heard Square Enix, who has heard Bandai Namco, should they stop thinking of these companies as inherently video game companies and more like media empires?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Square is more video game, I think. But Bandai Namco, it's better to just think of them as a multimedia company. Bandai is a toy company first and foremost. They've been doing the cross-promotional marketing thing even longer than Pokemon has. Gundam is the template for that. You know, you release a new Gundam series, and then you have a bunch of different Gunpla model kits ready to go. They were doing that longer than Pokemon was by a really long time. From about like 1998 through the mid 2010s, we did have a situation where like almost every game that came out, or like at least everything in the monster collecting space, but then also F-Zero, Dot Hack, Gungrave. Gungrave's anime is arguably more famous than Gungrave, the game, at this point. Every single visual novel that you can think of would get an adaptation at some point, especially the dating sims, because, you know, the harem genre was going crazy at that point. To promote all of the Sonic games that they were putting on GameCube, they made Sonic anime, finally, even though prior to that, Sonic only had cartoons in the United States. Tales of started getting both anime OVAs and full anime. Capcom has produced a series of fully CG anime movies based on Resident Evil. And Mega Man Battle Network, another great example. That had an anime running alongside the games for years. There's countless examples from this era of every game had to have an anime for a while. And a lot of them were very bad.
How does that compare to right now?
What I find interesting about the current era is that now that has died down a little, like a little, to be clear. There's still quite a few anime based on video games every single year. But now that it's chilled a little bit, there is a bit of a sense that like a game getting a really good anime adaptation is sort of a prestige moment that can put it back in the public consciousness.
Like Nier?
Yeah, like Nier, for example. Yeah, Nier, I haven't watched the full Nier anime, but I think that knowing Taro, that almost certainly is like necessary reading to understand the full storyline of Nier. But to the point of these more prestige adaptations, you see stuff like this year, there was Noja, which was a PS Vita single-player Among Us type social deduction visual novel about you're in a ship, one of your crewmates is an alien imposter, and you've got to vote them down until only one's left. But as a visual novel, not as like a multiplayer game. And that got a really good anime adaptation just this season. This summer, one of the most talked about anime that got a lot of eyes on the game too was Nukitashi the Animation, which if you're not familiar with that, I don't know if just describing it would probably make this an 18 plus podcast. So I'm not gonna go into that. Like when I edit videos about that, I cannot show shots of the main characters walking down the street because there's too much sex happening. So there are like now game franchises that have recurring anime that people look forward to, Uma Musume being a good example. And then, you know, obviously the big example that I think set that trend in motion is Cyberpunk Edgerunners, which played a not insignificant role in revitalizing interest in Cyberpunk 2077 after it had been fixed, but prior to like the big 2.0 update that like fundamentally changed it and made it, I think, one of the best sandbox games of all time. But a couple years before that, the thing that finally got me to pick up Cyberpunk 2077 when it wasn't as broken was Trigger making an original anime set in that universe that got me invested in the world building and gave me like an anchor point that made me want to get into all the games.
To wrap things up, gaming culture itself is such a piece of anime. Whether that is isekai, where people are transported into the video games, or it is a romance where one of the characters or both of the characters are otaku, or anything. I was hoping that you could give listeners, again, people who are unfamiliar with most of what is out there, kind of a smattering of 3 or 4 shows that they should check out across that spectrum, that if they just identify as a gamer or they like game culture, they might enjoy these animes that are not adaptations of games. They are not about a video game, but they are like seeped in gaming culture.
Like you said, like you can pick basically any isekai and that applies to it. But my favorite isekai is ReZero, which is, to like explain ReZero, you have to give the general context of isekai, which is isekai, they send characters to game worlds and usually they'll give them some kind of cheat power that makes them more like a game protagonist, like they can use all the magic, or there's in Another World with my smartphone, he's got a magic smartphone that lets him look up stuff, like looking up a game guide, for example, right? So there's this trope of you go into a game world, or adjacent to that, you are born in a world that has the rules of an RPG, and then the main character usually has some special skill that makes him extra special in this world. What I like about ReZero is, or one of the things I like about ReZero is how it flips that on its head, and it does it in such a ingenious way where the main character, Natsuki Subaru, he comes to this world, he thinks he's going to meet a hot elf who's going to fall in love with him, he's going to become a hero and save the world, but, you know, he's just a otaku from his bedroom with no special skills, and like he does a lot of calisthenics, so he's like above averagely physically fit, but not a lot else going for him, and basically no survival instincts. So he really needs something special to keep him alive, and he doesn't get that. What he gets is the ability to respawn, like a save point, except he doesn't get to choose where the save points are. They just update. And his power only activates when he dies, which is usually horrible. Like, we're talking the first time he gets ambushed in a bar and a lady cuts his stomach open, all his guts spill out on the floor. The worst one is probably when he meets a horde of the killer rabbit from Monty Python, and they eat him from the inside out. So just all these horrific situations happening to him as he fumbles his way through this fantasy world like a realistic, socially inept otaku would. And his only advantage is he can just keep doing it over until he gets it right. And through that, he ends up going through very slow, equally painful character development where he's got to look at himself and his own sort of hang-ups and issues and sense of entitlement as otaku who just, you know, ran away from real life because it was too hard and plays video games for instant gratification. He's got to really confront himself and everything he doesn't like about himself to become the hero he wanted to be. And that process is much more brutal and difficult than he expected going in. So that's my high bar for isekai. That is pretty brutal, though.
And what outside of the isekai?
I already mentioned Cyberpunk Edgerunners. I think that's one of the best anime of the last decade. A fantastic, short, ride. If you've played Cyberpunk and you haven't seen Edge Runners, it's such a minutely faithful adaptation of the game setting and the game rules. Like every single character, while they feel just like a character who exists in an anime, has like a specific build that you can build in Cyberpunk 2077 if you want to. They're all using the same pieces that you have from the game. I want to hit on a couple more in the isekai space really fast that I think will appeal to gamers. Log Horizon, if you are into MMORPGs, is an amazing translation of the culture of MMOs and the strategic elements, the gameplay. It's about an entire, like, everybody who's playing a regular MMORPG one day, they blink and they wake up in the world of that MMORPG. And they don't know why, and they can't die, and they don't know why that's happening either. And they sort of have to deal with the geopolitical fallout of that in a world that was just a video game, but now it's real and it's got, real people in it. And that's a really interesting one. And then more recently, Shangri-La Frontier. It's a story about this guy who, the whole VR MMO Sword Art Online sort of situation where, like, you put on a helmet, you dive into a game. This is a future where that technology has advanced to the point that dog shit game developers who are just pumping out slop can make full VR MMOs. And his hobby is going into these kusoge, that's shitty games, that's a whole subculture in Japan. His hobby is playing kusoge, VR MMOs specifically. So there's all these different cool ideas for futuristic shitty games, but he takes a break from that hobby to play the Kamige, the god game Shangri-La Frontier, which is basically like if Dark Souls was an MMO. So it's very reflex-based. You got to put a lot of thought into your build and watch boss patterns and stuff. And it makes the process of just watching him figure out this game world and learn how to play the game and get good very fascinating. And the more games you play, the more you'll understand just like how authentic the like thought process going into each boss battle is, and how he's building his character makes sense. As like a big gamer nerd, that one scratches an itch for me that almost nothing else does. So I'd recommend that one. And yeah, outside of isekai, it's a little trickier. So it's mostly game adaptations I'd want to recommend. This season, Digimon Beat Break is the best Digimon anime since season 3 Tamers. If anybody grew up on Digimon watching this, it's really good. I would highly recommend watching that. Not necessarily a lot of like gamerisms in that.
I think that's a perfect spot to end it. It is all very full circle. Before we wrap, where should people find you?
You can find me on my YouTube channel, Mother's Basement, where I do less rambly than this explanations and analysis of anime. I have a series called Ones to Watch, where I just break down all the best anime of each new season as they're coming out. It's first impressions, so things can change. Sometimes the anime I recommend will get bad. Sometimes anime I don't recommend will get good. But generally, I think that those are a pretty good place to start if you're looking to get into seasonal anime and find some new stuff to discover. If you're not bothered by anime bullshit, I also have a series called Hottest Trash that comes out a little later in the season, where I review and roast the trashiest anime of every season affectionately. I differentiate between trash, which is just media that doesn't give a shit, and garbage, which is just bad. But yeah, if you want to just get a taste of the seedier side of anime, that's a fun way to do it. And if you want to talk about the absolute best anime of all time, I also have a new podcast that I am doing with two of my best buddies called Quest for the Best, where we watch a new anime basically every week. We're probably going to be slowing that production schedule down a little in the new year because a new anime every week proved to be impossible to do anything longer on. But our goal there is to nail down the top 100 greatest anime of all time. And, we just have a lot of fun arguing and analyzing and just generally having spirited discussions about anime that you probably won't see a lot of video essays about just because they're not the top 20 things that get views on YouTube. Please go check that out if you'd like to see some interesting anime, old and new.
Thank you so much for joining me, dude. This is super fun.
Thanks for having me, man.
Welcome to the Patreon bonus. You know how this works. Here is where we split up. If you are a Patreon supporter, great. We're going to stick around with Jeff a little bit longer, and he is going to share the anime that every gamer should watch. We're talking anime adapted by games, games that inspired anime set in video game universes, but not actual video games. It is a ride, and I think that you will enjoy it. If you are not a Patreon supporter, no worries at all. We have the news of the week still, and it was a big week for video game news because it was the Game Awards. I was actually at the Game Awards in person, rubbing elbows with the stars of the video game industry, and I have so much to tell you about who won, who lost, who was there, all of the drama. Can't wait to tell you all about that. So either way, you have more coming up. Let's split. Act 3, the news of the week. Welcome everybody, it's time to talk about the Game Awards. Now, two things can be completely true. One, the Game Awards' actual award segments were effectively void of surprises. We had reason to believe that Clair Obscur Expedition 33 would win practically everything it was nominated for, including the Game of the Year, and that is what happened. It nearly swept its categories, but the weird thing is, those awards and their speeches were mere decoration for the real show. Hours of video game announcements, reveals, and promotions. Which gets us to fact 2. When it comes to surprises, the Game Awards game announcements were actually pretty full of them. This year, more than ever, felt like the Game Awards having successfully replaced E3 as the industry's most important annual promotional event. What were the standouts, you might be wondering? The longtime director of the Yakuza Like a Dragon series, Toshihiro Nagoshi, left Sega's publisher group years ago to create something new, and now we know what that game is. Gang of Dragons looks a lot like Yakuza, but now with action movie icon Don Lee. The project is published by NetEase, who seems to be taking a lot of that juicy, fresh, living game money and putting it into more traditional blockbuster projects, expressed, in this case, with the movie star protagonist and the graphical fidelity that is on par with the Like a Dragon games, which matters because Gang of Dragons will be compared to the Yakuza series for the rest of its existence. A similar story, The Last of Us 1 co-director Bruce Straley also left his high-profile role many years ago to make his own project, and we now know what that one is. Coven of the Chickenfoot is an adventure game about an elderly witch, her critter companion, and, as far as I can tell, basically puzzles. Early word has compared the project to The Last Guardian, but we don't know a whole lot more about it than that. Amazon Games announced not one, but 2 Lara Croft Tomb Raider games, one launching in 2026, the other launching in 2027, and the latter looks like it could be an open world game. And speaking of sequels that appear to be taking more linear adventures into the open world sphere, Remedy showed a new entry in the Control series, Control Resonant, which features a new protagonist, Dylan Faden, little brother of Control's original protagonist, Jesse Faden. He appears to step out of the old house and into a very strange, ripped-apart version of Manhattan, and the combat is less gunplay and more Devil May Cry. It looks neat. From there, we get into the land of pseudo-sequels and reimaginings, their identities slightly tweaked due to new ownership or breaks from past publishing partners. Larian Studios, the group behind Baldur's Gate 3, announced that its next game returns to the Divinity series, the one that they actually own. Simply titled Divinity, it appears to be a reboot of sorts, inviting in all the Baldur's Gate 3 fans who might have missed Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2, and will be attracted to, I guess, a fresh start. Elsewhere, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic is perhaps the most beloved series in Star Wars video games. Its director is returning to lead a team creating a spiritual follow-up, Star Wars Fate of the Old Republic. Plus, on the Star Wars spiritual sequel note, some former Criterion developers, the people responsible for the Burnout series and the best Need for Speed games, are making a Star Wars racing game that itself looks like a spiritual sequel to that Nintendo 64 pod racing game. Though it is not in space, if you love airborne dogfights, Bandai Namco appears to be putting in a considerable chunk of change to make the new Ace Combat game the one that breaks into the mainstream. Ace Combat 8's reveal trailer emphasized a story that looks part anime, part Top Gun. Ace Combat 7 was the one that really brought me into the series, so yeah, I'm pretty into it. And then there's the most complicated and yet uncomplicated sequel of them all, Resident Evil Requiem, aka RE9. It begins a new story in the Resident Evil series following a beloved 3-game trilogy that culminated with Resident Evil 8. Should be fresh, should be new, should be exciting and surprising. And yet, the Game Awards trailer focused entirely on news that Resident Evil 9 will co-star longtime franchise heartthrob Leon S. Kennedy. Now, I could be bummed that this pulls the series backward rather than pushing it forward. But, and maybe I'm just being a fan here making excuses, Resident Evil has always folded back in on itself, building new roads that loop back to Raccoon City. And in terms of a game experience, the series has a very long history of their games starting with these traditional, interesting survival horror experiences that gradually build toward over-the-top action. I think Resident Evil 6, for example, starts with a weaponless nobody in a small rural home and ends with you firing automatic rifles at paramilitary troopers on a cargo ship. With 2 lead characters in this game, perhaps Requiem will create a pace closer to Alan Wake 2, allowing players to bounce between action and horror rather than having a whole bunch of one and then a whole bunch of the other. But again, I might just be making excuses. All of this is perfectly exciting, even if it is a bunch of AAA stuff and it is a bunch of sequels. But none of it has to do with the awards, like South of Midnight winning Games for Impact, or, and this is relevant to today's episode, Uma Musume winning Best Mobile Game. More than ever, it feels as if gaming's greatest night should be split into 2. Yes, fewer people will watch the awards half of that double-day feature, but tens of millions of people getting to see all of the important acceptance speeches and the games that are actually out this year having the space to be showcased, to breathe, is better than 100 million people mistaking the few awards that are shown as necessary bathroom breaks between all of the flashy trailers. I was there, so I'll just add a little bit more color and detail. It is a thing now. The Game Awards has been going on for a long time, as you can hear about in the previous episode of this show. And it kind of flagged following COVID. I remember being actually at the first pseudo in-person Game Awards following COVID, and the place was empty. There's a hotel right next door where a lot of people tend to meet for drinks afterwards. and that was a ghost town. Last night, the hotels in the area had to have security because they were actually at capacity, as in it was dangerous for more people to come in. More people are flooding LA Live and downtown Los Angeles for this event each year, and it is truly the E3 experience right now. In just one night, I bounced between the awards, the various parties at different hotels, multiple newsrooms happening either in hotel rooms or spare conference center space, the live show that Fandom was putting on with GameSpot. There is an entire enterprise. Blizzard was there cooking meat to promote Diablo 4. I don't know why I'm sharing that one of all of them, but it was just it was weird. It is a carnival. It is a spectacle now. And that, again, is not bad. But it doesn't feel like an awards show. It feels like it is having to play the role of 5 or 6 different things for the games industry in the span of about 12 hours. So I'm hoping that wherever this is going, that it starts to spread out. And I don't know how that works with it being in December. I don't think people want to be away from their families that long during December and so close to the holidays. But at the same time, whatever this is, it feels like we are getting diminishing returns for the quality of any one thing. That you can get a lot, but none of it is especially great. I hope that changes. I hope that Jeff Keighley and company see this as an opportunity to actually allow themselves to do more, or it will get tighter and tighter and more overcrowded. And in doing that, the people that will fall out are the people who can't afford to be there. And as we've seen in a story that I will link, I worry that in time that may even include some of the nominees. So, we'll see. It's a weird thing. It is a flagrant celebration of capitalism, and yet it is a crucial part of how this industry works. And to ignore it is to kind of put your head in the sand a little bit. You don't have to like it, but it is happening. And if you want it to change, gotta start thinking of alternatives. Woof! And that is the news of the week. And that is a wrap. Congratulations, we are now all honorary weebs. And thank goodness, because with anime and manga, consuming popular culture, it is important to know your Dragon Balls from your Dragon Quests. Next week, the final mailbag of 2025, I field your questions reflecting on this busy and constantly surprising year of video games and answer cues about what to expect in 2026. Do you have a question? Send me a voice note at postgamesmailbag, that's all one word, at gmail.com. I would love to hear it and include it on the show. A reminder, Postgame supporters get the show and the newsletter early on Fridays at 5 p.m. Eastern, usually quite a bit earlier. They get extra acts and bonus materials. This week, Patreon listeners got an entire extra segment with the host of Mother's Basement, in which we got our own concierge experience of anime for people who love video games. Another thing that just went live earlier this week on the Patreon, a bonus episode that is the history of the creation of Pokemon, the years just before and right after the release of Pokemon in Japan and the United States. It has a very special guest, Brendan Vigley of Wavelengths and Into the Aether. It is a great episode and has so many little details about Pokemon history that I didn't know until I started research for it. Plus, you get the 5-part video series, Video Game Journalism 101. You get an oral history of Street Fighter the movie, and so much more, and no ads on anything. Subscribe to the Patreon at patreon.com/postgames. Subscribe to the newsletter for free and get all of the show notes at post.games. Postgames logo by James Barham. Theme by Mark Sparling, and a special thank you to this week's guest, Jeff Thu of Mother's Basement. Like the show, please consider leaving a review on Apple or Spotify. It does a humongous help for the show. Really, legit does. Or share the show with a friend. That helps a lot too. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week.